So at this Philadelphia convention, there's a lot of back and forth because, again, there's competing interests, but we are left with three primary compromises that'll shape the direction of the young nation. So, compromise number one deals with Congress. What is Congress actually going to look like? Now, we know that the legislative branch is viewed to be the most important because Article 1 of the Constitution, which deals with Congress, is by far the longest section. Now, it also explains why debate over what Congress is going to look like took about 1.5 months to resolve. So, of the states in the U.S. at the time, Georgia and Pennsylvania were the only two that had a unicameral legislature, meaning they only had one house. So, there's a prevailing belief that this federal legislature would be bicameral, meaning they would have two chambers. The number of representatives each should have was the sticking point. Now, James Madison wanted proportional representation. Proportional, meaning both are determined by populations. And he reasoned that more opinions could lead to more checks and prevent a tyranny of the majority. Now, John Dickinson of Delaware wanted senators to be chosen by state governments to keep the states involved in national affairs. The man on screen, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, was the first to propose what we now know of as the Great Compromise. And he did this in mid-June, but it was defeated. Now, a New Jersey man named William Patterson first presented the idea of keeping the basic legislative structure of the Articles, and so it becomes known as the New Jersey Plan. Now, many weeks later, what they called a grand committee was assembled to take up the issue, and the eventual compromise stood. Now, the third name, George Mason, was a firm believer in states' rights, and he was frustrated with the direction the convention was going. Madison's refusal to compromise was actually blamed for the opposition that formed and kind of seen as the reason why debate was so heated. So this is sometimes called the Connecticut Compromise because Sherman is from Connecticut, or the Great Compromise. And again, it's bicameral. There are two parts of Congress. First part being the House of Representatives. This is the part that's proportional. So the number of representatives is determined by the number of people in your state. This was the part of the federal government designed to directly represent the people, which is why representatives had 2-year terms. So there could be consistent elections and potentially consistent turnover to reflect the will of the people. The House also was given what was called the power of the purse, meaning that any and all spending bills would have to begin in the House of Representatives. So you have the House and then the Senate. The Senate actually was somewhat organized following this idea that states needed to be involved. So John Dickinson wins out in a sense. Each state gets 2 representatives. That's it. Done. End of story. No matter how many people they have. Senators choose 6-year terms, and these senators are chosen by the state governments. They are appointed by the state government. So one part of the national legislature is representative of the people, one is representative of the states. And visually, this is how it pans out even to this day. The House and the Senate. More people in your state means more representatives. Fewer people means fewer representatives. And then it doesn't matter how big or small you are, you each get 2 senators. So compromise number 1, Congress. Took a month and a half to figure it out, but it's out of the way. Now the second compromise, how are the populations of each state counted to figure out representation? So this is going to go back to the fact that each state gets 1 representative for every 30,000 inhabitants. So when it comes to population or people living within each state, you have those that are considered Americans. You have the phrase other persons. That's the phrase the Constitution uses. And this is the phrase that was used in Philadelphia. These are individuals who are enslaved. Then you have indigenous inhabitants. How should all of these people be counted for the purpose of representation? So we have what's called the 3/5 compromise. And keep in mind, this is political. This is not necessarily a social commentary on slavery. This is a political compromise. The individuals who gathered in Philadelphia more or less thought that their job was to form a government, get a nation going off the ground. They figured that the next generation would be able to resolve the issue of slavery. So we have this 3/5 rule where you have every 5 slaves counted as 3 individuals, or 3/5 of a person. One of the delegates actually proposed eliminating it because it would give an advantage to the South, and his proposal was defeated 10-1. So this is, there were fears that the South would be overrepresented, and there were also real fears that if slavery were eliminated in Philadelphia, every Southern delegate would leave, and there would be no nation. So again, this is purely political. Purely political. Begs the question, why 3/5? It seems like an odd fraction. And it goes back to the early 1780s under the Articles, when James Madison tried to propose a method by which there could be a general fund for the national government, since taxation was actually illegal. Each state would have to contribute a specific dollar amount based on their property taxes, and everybody assumed that each state would lie, so they would, pay less. So that was unreliable. Madison proposed payment according to population, and he wanted 2 slaves counted as 1 person because a large portion of Southern wealth came from slave labor. Northern representatives countered by saying, no, 3/4. Every slave counts as 3/4 because then the South would be taxed more. So Madison does the math, comes up with 3/5 as a compromise. It was accepted. That's why 3/5 becomes a fraction that everybody knows, nobody necessarily questions. And you can see that there are 4 states who gain representatives based on the 3/5 compromise: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. So this is something that is going to factor in. So we have a compromise over Congress, a compromise over counting people for the population and indirectly on slavery. Then compromise 3. How do we pick the executive, known as the president? So keep in mind that every person knew that Washington would be the first president. Everybody knew that the man presiding over the Philadelphia Convention would be the first president. It's just a matter of what's going to happen next. Now, at this time, in the late 1780s, transportation was the same as it had been during Roman times. You can either walk, ride a horse, take a carriage, or go in a boat that's at the mercy of the wind and the current. Travel hadn't necessarily changed a whole lot in thousands of years. It was also very unreliable, especially in winter and spring when a lot of the waterways and muddy roads were impassable. Now, this concept of factions were what they called political parties, and they were believed to incite division, and, actively campaigning for public office is viewed negatively. Communication also moved very slow. So you got all these factors to consider when we determine how to select a leader. Now, the first potential solution, have Congress do it. Just have the national legislature pick a president. That's it. And this is somewhat what happens in Great Britain, where you have Parliament, and the majority party in Parliament picks what's called a prime minister. Well, that's a non-starter because we don't necessarily want to be like England. And this didn't really fly because it was said to potentially lead to corruption, where congressmen could be bribed to pick a president, and it would really upset the balance of powers between the legislative and executive branch. So that's out. Maybe state legislatures or state governments could pick the president. Well, that was seen as undermining the autonomy of the federal government, and it might lead to the same struggles that existed under the Articles of Confederation, where states were viewed to have too much power. Maybe a direct popular vote. Let the people decide. Well, information doesn't move very fast. quite honestly. We know that communication is slow. And no clear-cut winner means there could be so many candidates that no candidate receives an over 50% majority. There was also this fear that large states, or states with a lot of people like Virginia or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania, could end up picking the president. So what do we do under circumstances like this? And interestingly enough, all three of these were combined to figure out a solution. Congress, state government, and popular vote. Now, James Madison was on the Committee of Postponed Parts. That's the actual name of it, Committee of Postponed Parts, that decided it. And we get the Electoral College. The electoral votes, meaning the people who pick the president, would be determined by the number of representatives and senators. So a state's representatives plus their 2 senators, that's the number of electoral votes they have. The state legislatures would in turn pick the electors, and the popular vote would help them determine how the electors voted. So all of them are combined. Each elector got 2 votes, and only one of them could be for someone from their home state. Now, to ensure that the second vote counted, the second place finisher became the vice president. Ties and non-majority winners, that's going to be decided by the House of Representatives. And in that case, the Senate will select the vice president. So it's a system that was designed to deal with the problems of the time and is certainly still with us today. It's still the methodology by which we pick the president. So first compromise is dealing with Congress, second dealing with state populations, and the third, the Electoral College and how we pick the president.